Section 13 of Music by Ursula Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, Italian Opera. There is one special kind of music that we now have to consider, which was not influenced at all by Bach or Haydn. During Bach's lifetime, Italian opera was given in all important towns, and most people considered opera the most important kind of music. Concerts such as we know now were then usually given in noblemen's private houses or by musical people among themselves, and the few public ones were attended only by educated people. But it was different with opera performances. They offered a sort of music everyone enjoyed. We can still hear the kind of singing which was then popular when we go to a concert and some famous singer gives an aria of that period with wonderful trills and long notes, and performs all sorts of difficult feats. Singing like this was highly appreciated in those days. People would time how long a singer held a certain note, and go wild with excitement when he or she did something very wonderful and difficult. The singers had become so important that the songs in the operas were written specially for them, and the interest of the opera lay less in the story than in the way the singers sang their solos. This opera music was Italian in origin, but it was found everywhere. France had opera of its own, written by musicians who imitated Lully, and Germany had opera at Hamburg under the composer Kaiser. But in Paris, Italian opera was given. It was universal. As famous opera singers demanded enormous sums of money in payment for their services, only a few could be engaged for any opera, and as they were often very jealous of each other, each had to be as important as another, and operas were so influenced by this that at last they were all written in a stereotyped manner. Each singer had to have so many solo songs in each act, and no trouble was taken about the recitative parts of the work, for no one listened to them. In fact, the sense of the whole story did not matter much, only the feeling in each song. When Handel wrote operas, his genius was so great that he made the story of his operas matter, and in spite of having such fixed arrangements for the singers, he wrote works that were really dramatic and moving. But even he had great difficulties with his singers, and he did not alter the accepted way in which operas were written, with arias of set kinds in set numbers for each singer. He only succeeded in using that way in so masterly a manner that its absurd conventions were lost sight of in the beauty and power of his music. The singers of the time were very talented performers. A really great singer of that day, given a good, broad, smooth melody, could so use his voice that even if the music was rather dull, he put such life and feeling into his performance that his audience was completely carried away. The way, however, in which operas had to be written to please such singers would seem to us really ridiculous. Goldoni, the well-known writer of Italian plays, describes how he once wrote the words for an opera, and a famous dancer to whose house in Milan he went introduced him to one of the directors of the theater so that he might read the libretto with a view to its being produced. Several opera singers were present, among them the famous Cafariello. After hearing a few sentences, Cafariello said the libretto was impossible because the part he would take entailed his appearance at the beginning so that he would not be properly heard with the noise of people still entering the theater. Another singer also criticized the libretto, saying no opera was ever written with 9 singers. 7 was the most that could be employed. When finally the director, unable to control the noise and confusion, took Goldoni into another room to hear the whole work, he explained that though Goldoni had indeed written a good tragic play, the libretto was not suited to opera, because opera then had to follow rules quite without sense. A play that would please the public, he said, was useless. The first thing was to please the singers. In order to do that, there must be only 3 principal singers. Each must have 5 airs to sing, and the less important singers must only have 3 airs. And above all, it was most important not to give the less important singers anything very interesting to sing, as that would never be allowed by the principals. The director went on to give Goldoni many more rules about how the composer of the music must have places where he could make special effects, and the scene painter must also be considered. And Goldoni was convinced, as is anyone who reads his narrative, that though Italian opera at that time may have been concerned with beautiful singing, it certainly did not demand either a good libretto or perfect music. These Italian operas were regarded as important works, and written as they were according to such set conventions and rules. If the composer was learned but not inspired, they were lacking in feeling and the music in parts was dry. The singers' powers of making the effect of the music as they sang often gave such arias a vitality that they did not naturally possess, and the rest of the music sounded all the more uninteresting in contrast, though probably no one listened to it. There were, of course, composers such as Gemelli and Porpora, who had great gifts for writing dignified arias in operas of this kind, arias being the part of the music that mattered most. Such opera is now called opera seria, and it became customary in Italy for light musical interludes to be added between the acts as a relaxation from the strain of listening to the operas themselves. These interludes gradually formed little comic plays, and after each act of the opera seria there came a short act of a comic play, also to music. Gradually these light interlude plays were so well written that they were in turn regarded as operas, only of a light and comic kind. As well as these interlude operas, or intermezzi, as they were sometimes called, some composers tried the experiment of setting to music comic plays, some of them written in the local dialect. These were not, like the intermezzi, written to be performed in separate acts between the various acts of an opera seria, but were written to be performed as an evening's entertainment in themselves. The famous Scarlatti wrote light opera of this kind, and so did several well-known composers. Leonardo Leo, 1694 to 1744, Leonardo Vinci, 1690 to 1730, Nicola Logorschino, 1700 to 1763, and Pergolesi, 1710 to 1736. Such light opera was called opera buffa, and it became very popular. Opera buffa, or comic opera as we should call it, was a far more natural and amusing entertainment than the important operas, and the best works of this kind attained a great success all over Europe. When Pergolesi's opera buffa was given between the acts of one of Lully's operas in Paris, a famous Frenchman was among the audience, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was much impressed by this delightful work, and did his best to rouse the interest of the Parisians in this new gay art, while he himself wrote the first French light opera, opéra comique, as it is called, Le Devin du Village. The Italian company which performed the comic operas of Pergolesi and others in Paris had an immense success. The singers might not be very wonderful, but the music was charming. The Parisians showed that they, like the Italians, could enjoy light opera with its delicate music, its light-hearted humor, and gay simplicity. Rousseau's championship of this new art aroused the opposition of the Parisians who supported the regular French opera. The partisans on each side were very jealous of each other, and Paris became the scene of a fierce controversy, still known as the Guerre des Bouffons. However, comic opera became more and more popular, and French composers with little musical education, but with a genius for light music, began to produce works of this kind. The earliest French composer of opera comique was Monsigny, 1729 to 1817, and he was followed by Grétry, 1741 to 1813. These composers wrote music which still charms us by its gaiety, pathos, grace, and humor. It is useless to listen to it expecting to hear what to a trained musician would be things of technical interest, interesting use of instruments and themes and such devices, which are part of the power of composers musically educated. But the music is youthful, light-hearted, and sometimes brilliant. The accompaniments may seem thin to us, but the melodies are tuneful and the feeling of the characters has truth and charm. Opera seria was still a popular art, and when comic opera became so successful, cultivated musicians wrote comic as well as serious operas. Many of these later composers were famous in their day, though their music is now heard very seldom. Such were Piccini, 1728 to 1800, Cimarosa, 1749 to 1801, Paisiello, 1741 to 1815, and Paer, 1771 to 1839. When Mozart's operas, with their depth of feeling, their marvelous new powers of orchestration, and their many beauties, became known in Italy and France, the works of these composers sounded empty in comparison. And though a few of these operas, such as Cimarosa's Il matrimonio segreto, are revived at times and are still delightful, many of the works of this period sound superficial and empty, and revivals are rare. When light opera was first produced in Paris, the greatest French composer of the day was Rameau. He wrote operas in the accepted manner like Lully and his followers, and he had a far greater sense of beauty than Lully. He was a much more cultivated musician, and his new orchestral effects and new harmonies and rhythms did much to make opera more vivid and expressive. Unlike contemporary Italian composers, to whom opera seems to have meant a collection of songs to display the voice, Rameau, in company with other composers of the French school, was interested in the dramatic feeling of his operas. He realized how much of this lay in moving recitative, and this part of his operas was especially striking. It was beautiful, dignified, and effective. It was these recitatives that made a great impression on the next most famous opera composer, Willibald Gluck. Gluck, 1714 to 1787, was born 18 years before Haydn. When he first began to write operas, he studied in Italy and wrote like Italian composers. He was invited to England at the time that Handel was in London, and Italian opera was very popular. But the work Gluck produced was a complete failure. For 16 years he studied, trying to find what principles would make opera a unified work of art, and for 6 years he lived in Vienna, where he constantly produced new music, and where he was for a time singing master to Marie Antoinette. At last he produced an opera, Orpheus and Eurydice, which was quite unlike the accepted Italian opera. Gluck used no rules. He wrote solos, chorus, concerted pieces, and different effects of orchestral music exactly as he liked. The music was only there to enhance the story, not to show off the voices of the singers. The Viennese found such a work difficult to listen to and did not enjoy it. And when he produced another opera, Alceste, 5 years later, it was again coldly received. His first great success was an opera called Iphigenia in Aulis, produced in Paris in 1774 by the influence of his old pupil Marie Antoinette. So sincere was the expression, so simple the melodies, and the whole work had such dramatic power that it was greeted with an ovation. He wrote 2 more important operas, Armide and Iphigenia in Tauride, and his works became models for serious opera. Not only did Gluck set opera free from the caprices of singers, and show composers how important and effective it was to write music that helped to emphasize the meaning of the play, but he also made technical improvements in vocal accompaniment. In Handel's operas, a harpsichord played all the time with its rather jingling sound. Alessandro Scarlatti had tried to do without it, and Gluck would not have a harpsichord at all. He wanted his effects of sound to be different and clear and varied, not always mixed with the sound of the harpsichord. The beauty of Gluck's work has never faded. The years since he lived have produced many changes in the way music for operas is written, but his operas even now have lost none of their charm. The means he used were very simple, for he was not a technically accomplished musician, but the depth of beauty he produced with such means is unforgettable. He was so filled with the desire to produce only music that was sincere that at times he unnecessarily sacrificed his natural feeling for beauty to his feeling for dramatic truth, as if such feelings were opposed. But this sense of opposition disappeared in his later work, and his operas are full of lovely melodies and lovely passages of sound. And apart from the intrinsic charm of his work lies that which gave his operas such an influence on later composers. He was the first musician who made each opera a single whole, with an individual atmosphere entirely its own. Each of his operas, from the beginning of the overture to the end of the work, is a united whole, creating a special and living atmosphere. To enhance the dramatic truth of the story, and thus make the atmosphere of the work, Gluck poured out his enchanting music and created new beauties of sound, both descriptive and passionate. As a matter of history, and as a guide to the sort of music to expect from certain composers, it is interesting to understand the differences which underlay Italian, French, and German opera. That there were real differences, fully appreciated by audiences at the time, is certain. Italian opera in the hands of Peri, Caccini, and Monteverde was a new and moving form of art. The stories for such serious operas were taken at first from Greek tragedies, and in any case they were never humorous. Themes of this kind to be carried out in music needed powers that many composers did not possess. They could write songs, which were the most easily appreciated parts of any opera, and since Italians as a nation were devoted to singing, this was the part of their operas that received all their attention. In studying public taste without any vision of their own, the work of many Italian composers became very artificial. Their music did, however, develop the art of expressive solo singing, and the solo songs called arias were the special characteristic of Italian opera. In opera buffa, which also originated in Italy, though the singers did not matter much and the aim was to have a simple, natural story of daily life with comic characters and plenty of human gaiety, it was still the melodies for solo voices that were the important part of the opera. And gay, well-written tunes were entertainment enough, even if the stories were sometimes rather stupid. Opera buffa might not be so magnificent as opera seria, but it combined lovely songs with natural gaiety, and thus appealed both to the Italian love of gaiety as well as to the national love of singing. French taste was far more interested in the story and general outline of the drama than in the actual singing, and this can be seen in the operas of Lully, the first composer of French opera, and Rameau. In them, dances, chorus, and declamation, or as we should say, recitative, are all important, and the interest lies in them quite as much as in the songs. In the hands of lesser composers, the music became dull, and French opéra comique had an added popularity in contrast to the serious operas written by composers who were not great enough to carry out their aim of grand dramatic work. The special characteristic of German opera was the truth and fidelity of feeling expressed. It might only be at moments, but it was this depth of feeling that appealed to German audiences and made German operas a success. There was very little German opera before Mozart. The earliest works were founded on well-known Bible stories and then on homely stories of everyday life. War put an end to musical development on this line, and when German opera was revived, it was in the form of what was known as Singspiel, an operetta which was carried on partly in music and partly in speech, and it was in this form that Mozart wrote his German operas, Die Entführung aus dem Serail. Where the spoken part seems unimportant, So full is the music of beauty and imagination, and Zauberflöte, his last, most perfect work, with its unsurpassed depths of feeling and its expression of his unique vision. End of section 13 of Music by Ursula Creighton, read by Martha Weller, Champaign, Illinois, February 29th, 2024.